Good afternoon. Welcome back to the B&H virtual event space. Today you are tuned into the Beauty of Travel series. And today we're talking about Cityscapes hosted by Sony. So a huge thank you to Sony for hosting this wonderful series that we have coming up. And for that, I would like to introduce the man behind the series, photographer Jim Nix. Jim, what's going on?
Hey man, just hanging out, talking about photography like I like to do. So yeah, thanks.
Of course, it's always great to have you on, Jim. So
Appreciate
I'm going to do what I do best and get out of the way. But I will remind everybody, if you do have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. If you do have a question during, Jim's going to try to keep an eye on the chat there. So if you guys do have something that's relevant to what Jim is speaking about at the moment, don't hesitate to get that question in. Other than that, I will see you guys all in a bit for some Q&A.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I just want to make sure that everybody can see that. I'm going to assume that you can.
Yep, looks good.
Looks good. Okay, awesome. Yeah. Thanks again to Sony, of course, and to B&H as well for having me on this webinar. And there's two more, by the way. Today we're talking about cityscapes, and I'll walk through some things that I think about, kind of like we'll call them tips, I guess, for lack of a better word, and some sample images. And then I'll also do some edits in Luminar Neo, which is the editor I use most. I'm Jim Nix. I'm based in Austin, Texas, where it is finally not 100 degrees anymore. So I'm really excited about that. I'm actually wearing long sleeves for a change. You can find me. There's links here in this slide. My website is jimnix.com. And I do ask people if they're interested to subscribe to my newsletter. I send that out about once a week, and I include tips and tricks and ideas. I've got free presets in Luminar. Got a couple of free ebooks. I got a number of different things that I provide to those of you that follow along. You can also check me out on YouTube, where I share videos 2 to 3 times a week with editing tips and tricks. And of course, I have a Facebook page and an Instagram page that are fairly active as well. So with that in mind, we're going to go ahead and jump into this. And this is very informal. So as Derek said, if you got questions, feel free to ask, because I'd love to try to answer them for you. So as far as gear goes, I'm clearly a Sony fan. And there's 2 cameras that I have that are Sony's. My original was the A7 Mark II that I got about 6 or 7 years ago. And I used that for a number of years until about 2 or 3 years ago, I picked up the A7R3. And like many of us, I'm currently drooling over the A7R5. We'll see. But fantastic cameras, love the dynamic range, just the autofocus. I mean, so many things that are great about it. And as you can see on the left-hand side, I've got 2 zoom lenses, the 16 to 35, which is right here. This is the brand new GM2 version, and it's a fantastic lens. I just absolutely adore that thing, and I love the wide view that the 16 to 35 gives me. And then the other one that I use quite a bit is the 24 to 70, also the f2.8, also the second version of that, the GM2. And then as you can see on the right-hand side, I've got 4 prime lenses, the 14, the 20, the 24, and the 35. Use them for different things. For cityscapes, I'm primarily using the 2 zoom lenses that I just showed. But when I get into landscapes and street photography, which are the next 2 webinars in this series, that's more prime lens related things in some situations. Anyway, one of my key philosophies around photography is this quote from Ansel Adams, which I just absolutely adore. You don't take a photograph, you make it. And make implies a lot of different things to me. It's the planning and the preparation prior to going out. It's the execution when you're in the field, and it's the editing when you get home. And so it's a multi-step process, as you know, as photographers, but it's something that I think about quite a bit, because prior to being a photographer, and I've had people ask me questions that aren't photographers, that don't understand the lengths of that we go to capture the shot. But someone might say, "Oh, nice snap," and I know they mean that well, but sometimes it's hard not to take that as, "Hey," almost like an insult, where you're thinking, "Gosh, I put a lot of time and effort into getting this photo. It's not a snap. I didn't just show up, point my camera, click a button, and I was done. I had to think about it. I get my settings on my Sony cameras and lenses correct. I plan ahead, and then I edit later." Anyway, it's an active pursuit, as you know, and it's something that of course we all love to go and pursue. Now, I'm not going to go into depth into all this stuff, but I want to cover these at a bit of a high level. As far as tips for cityscapes specifically, planning ahead, of course, is a big deal. And there are apps like PhotoPills that can come into play here, depending on what you're trying to shoot. Like if you want to see if the sun is setting behind Big Ben, for example, that's, if you're going to London, that would be a great app. But generally, when I'm traveling to a city, and I'll use London as an example because it's my favorite city to go travel to and shoot in, I always make lists and then I try to group those. And so I will literally, and this is perhaps very old school, but I will print out a map of London, just a single page, and then I'll start noting where the shots are that I want to get and start grouping them. So I might think, okay, I get there on, Tuesday, on a Tuesday night, I want to do sunset here, and there's two other things nearby. And then Wednesday morning at sunrise, I'm going to go over here, and there's two other things nearby. So, I make a list, I group them by area, but I always try to keep in mind that you got to be flexible because things change, like the weather, for example. When I'm going to a destination that has a lot of kind of big ticket items, these are what I call the postcard shots. I often try to just go get the postcard shot done as soon as possible. And that the reason why is because you can't control things like the weather or conditions or access to whatever site it might be and things like that. And so because you might be inspired to go to somewhere like London by seeing a photo of sunset with Big Ben, you might think, I really want to get that shot. That might be what spurred you to go to London. It's one of the more famous shots and more popular and common, I would say, shots to take in London, but it's still a shot you want to get. And so my opinion is you get there, go get the shot, just get it off your list and know that you can go back later in the trip. But if the weather agrees, go get your shot right away. Then for me at least, I feel like I can relax a little bit and think, okay, well, I got that big ticket item, I got that thing done, and now I can kind of go focus on doing some of the other stuff. Because in any large city where you're going in and shooting these cityscapes, there is a lot of other stuff to go shoot. And so if you get the big ones out of the way, it kind of frees up your mind to get creative and do other things. For time of day, I'm a huge fan of sunrise. Not just with cityscapes, but also landscapes and even street photography. That's partly because I don't like crowds. And it's also because with crowds, you can't get shots that you may want to get at other times of day. So, for example, you might have a place where you think, oh, sunset here would be gorgeous in Paris or Prague. I'll use the Charles Bridge in Prague as an example. You might think, I want to get this gorgeous, gorgeous sunset. The clouds are great today. I can't wait to get to the Charles Bridge at 5 o'clock. Sunset's at 7. I'm going to find my shot and it's going to be amazing. The problem is 42,000 other people have the same idea and they all show up on the Charles Bridge and it is so, so crowded. And so my preference is to get up at sunrise, which for me, when I was in Prague doing this, I was up at 4 or 4:30 in the morning. And this requires a copious amount of caffeine, especially later in the day, just to stay awake till dinner. But I was on the Charles Bridge and I had it to myself. And I can't tell you how many times I've shared photos of the Charles Bridge with no one on it. And people are like, what kind of magic did you do to get rid of all the people? There was no magic. It was just, I sacrificed sleep. And so I'm a huge fan of sunrise. If you want those kind of shots, it of course depends on what your choices are. And I prefer to walk. I say everywhere, I like to walk. I like to get in the steps just like everybody else. I'm also human and get tired. So I don't want to imply that I walk from one end of London to the other in a single day, although I have, but that's exhausting. But walk a lot, maybe everywhere is an overstatement, but walk a lot, because I can't tell you how many times I've walked from this shot that's on my map to that shot that's on my map and realized, hey, there's 3 or 4 or 5 or 20 shots between point A and point B that I never would have found if I'd just gone straight from point A to point B by hopping on a bus or in a cab or on the tube in London. And so walking sets you kind of free to go find things. So those are a few things that I think about when I'm somewhere out shooting. Things I look for. I love skylines. I love reflections of skylines. If you can find a city that has a river running through the middle of it, that's ripe for cityscape type shots. And I love taking those. It's also a good opportunity for panos if you're into taking panos. Architecture is a big thing for me. Thus, I really like European cities because there's a lot of history and therefore a lot of older architecture. So think of London or Prague or Paris or Rome. I mean, talk about, ancient architecture, places like that. I just love. I'm a huge fan of street scenes. I used to really be into street scene paintings that you would see where, there's like a lone figure walking down a street, and it's usually in dusk or blue hour, and there's a little bit of that beautiful blue and yellow light, blue from the blue hour, and then yellow kind of from the street lights. And you've seen these paintings. That was way before I was ever into photography. I used to love those kind of paintings and still do. When I took up photography and started shooting, I just naturally started shooting those kind of scenes as well when I traveled. I love the sense of motion because cities are busy. And so for me, like a longer exposure, and by long, I don't mean like 2 minutes necessarily or something, but it could be 2 seconds or 3 seconds, like in London, again, another example. And you'll see one of these here in a bit, and that is get a double-decker bus going by, and you get this nice sense of motion, of activity, and it feels energetic to me in a photograph. And I like that because I think that conveys the energy of a city. Things that represent scale. For a long time, I was always shooting these sunrises, and I was trying to get them without any people whatsoever. Over time, I've kind of morphed to where I like having a couple people, or maybe just a few people, or maybe just one person in my photo if I can manage. That gives a sense of scale, because you can look at a city shot and you think, okay, wow, great, it's cool and it's nice and it's a big city, but that sense of scale by having a human in it can help quite a bit. And sometimes also I feel like having that human in the shot sort of connects them to your photo because they can imagine themselves standing there or whatever. So something I think about, and I do that a lot with my street photography as well. Lines and angles, those are everywhere in cities. And if possible, elevated viewpoints, kind of looking down on a city is pretty fun. So here's a few example photos, and then we'll jump into some edits. This is where I live here in Austin. And this was almost exactly a year ago. It was early November last year. So we were getting a little bit of that fall color, as you can see. And this was late in the afternoon on a cloudy day, which I think is pretty clear. So kind of accentuated some of the blues, kind of play off that difference in the colors between the bluer in the sky and the water, as well as the blue, a lot of the glass in the buildings, with that kind of thinner strip of warmth here kind of through the middle. And this was shot with the original 16-35 2.8 that I had, which I recently sold when I picked up the second version. But that was a shot. And then here's a second version of that shot from the exact same spot, as you can tell, but this is a pano taken at sunrise, actually prior to sunrise, and longer exposure. And I shot this with the 20-70 f4. Again, when I refreshed my gear really recently, like within the last few weeks, and I no longer have the 20-70 f4, I decided to go in favor of the 24-70 2.8 simply because of the brighter aperture. But I shot this panel with that 20-70, and as you can see there, I was able to capture quite a bit. And this is something I like. And as I said earlier, I love this sense of scale. You can see just it feels bigger, but also being able to have that skyline reflected. So cities that have these rivers running through them or water near them. So that could be London, that's Austin, that's Nashville, New York City, Chicago, a lot of major cities have rivers. I always look for those, seek those out, and look for interesting viewpoints to go capture some reflections if possible. Now, this is from London. This is called Leadenhall Market, and it's a really busy place during the week where there's tables out and there's people in these little shops, or if it's after hours, people are having a pint and that sort of thing. But I tend to go here on a Sunday morning as early as I can get up, and I have it to myself. And you wouldn't believe how crowded it is during the week. But again, that's early morning, especially on a weekend, leaves it pretty empty. The other reason I like going early is because a lot of these famous cities that you may be visiting, they're touristy. I mean, let's face it, right? We're all tourists at times, even though we're photographers. We play both roles, and I think that they're different. But there are times when we're tourists. But what do tourists do on vacation? They stay out late, they have fun, they sleep in because they're on vacation. Well, if they're sleeping in and I'm up shooting, they're not going to be in my photo. That's kind of the way I approach it. So This was the first 16-35, the f4, which I used with my first Sony camera. So that was the first 16-35 that they had, which I used a lot. But you can see the settings there, but just playing up the light and color and architecture. And speaking of architecture, this is Prague, as I was talking about a moment ago. So the Charles Bridge is technically behind me in this shot, but this is a street that leads off the Charles Bridge. And as you can see, I just love that historic architecture. It's beautiful and colorful, and it's empty. And that's because it was early morning at sunrise. I was up, I think I said 4:30. This I shot with the original 24-70 f4 when I first got Sony 6 or 7 years ago, whatever it was. So tight aperture of f22 gave me that nice little starburst on those lights as well. And 15 seconds gave me a little bit of fluid movement in the sky, which I think kind of plays up, complements the scene, I guess. I think it's interesting that the street here is kind of bluer or cooler, and the sky is cooler, but the building is a little bit warmer. So it's a little bit of that play of the cool tones and the warm tones kind of playing off of each other. Something I try to do a lot in my edits, and I'll show you this here in a minute. Here's another one that illustrates motion. This is the Moulin Rouge in Paris. And if you've been there, you know that this spinning thing right here in the center is a windmill with neon around it. It rotates really slowly, but because this was 6 seconds, I've got the full kind of sense of motion there, which I like. And so you can also see there was a car passing by. So I kind of timed it to get the sense of motion of that car, as well as the sense of motion of the windmill. It's slowly turning, but with 6 seconds, it turns enough that I was able to get that blur, that light trail, if you will. And that's something I like as well. Night photography in cities, when you have some neon like this, it just, I think, looks kind of fun. Okay, just a quick drink of water. Another shot from London, and I'll edit this photo here in a moment. As I mentioned, this was a double-decker bus going by, and I love light trails in cities. I just think they look so cool. And the beautiful thing about double-decker buses is it's twice as tall, so you get essentially a much bigger light trail. So it's a popular technique in London, and you can do these on pretty much any street because the buses are everywhere. Again, this was with the original f4, 16-35, but I shot this at its widest. And what I wanted to do is, this was what, about a second and a half. But you see the bus coming, and then you just, activate the shutter and time that in such a way that you get that nice blur. And I was trying to get it to where it didn't go all the way through the photo, which I succeeded. You can see the bus blur kind of stops right about here, about 2/3 of the way into the frame. And that's something I think about when you have something that's in motion. If you can plan it accordingly, I like to leave a little bit of room, which gives the viewer, I think, the sense that this thing is in motion and will continue in motion. And so the bus blur stops here because that's when the exposure ended. But I was able to time it well enough that it kind of, you get that blur, and that blur kind of stops. And I think that you just imagine that the bus is going to keep on going. And I wanted the wider view to give you the full sense of that scene where you've got people walking by. You can see they're kind of blurred out over here on the left, but you have some of that street, and you have those lines kind of converging on that point sort of down here in the distance. And so one of my favorite things to do is long exposures like this in the city at night. So speaking of mornings, this was a number of these photos I took a number of years ago with my first Sony camera, and thus the f4 version of these popular lenses. But this was a sunrise in Rothenburg, Germany, which is a gorgeous, beautiful town. And I was out the night before walking around and trying to shoot, and it was busy. But I got up for sunrise, and I was out before it was bright, and I was able to walk around, and I had streets that would normally be crowded any other time of day nearly to myself. You can see two people here. One, I believe, is a photographer. He's taking a photo of this little coffee shop, and this person, I assume, is going to get coffee and a pastry. But early morning, the sun is kind of rising in the distance. You can see the glow here, as well as the glow that's kind of coming through that arch and having these streets nearly empty is super fun for me. Now this is one where I had a 10-stop filter, and that's another thing I like to do, is to indicate that sense of motion with a long exposure, like a really long exposure, which is here 3 minutes with a 10-stop filter. And so this was the Ponte Vecchio, which is in Florence, Italy, and it was sunset, and I just went for that really long exposure to get incredibly smooth water and skies, just to give that sense of motion, like I said. And speaking of motion, I talked about street scenes, which I love, and this is Lower Manhattan in New York, and you know, I'm sure the B&H folks will recognize this area, but it's a fun little area to walk around and shoot in. And now this I shot a number of years ago with the 28 mil f2, which again I no longer have. I've changed out to the 20, the 24, and the 35 for my this type of photography. Partly because of the brighter apertures, but also because, especially with the 20 and the 24, I like that wider view. But the 28 worked great here, and I was able to get this person on the bike coming towards me, and I try to line it up. I stood right here, kind of on the curb, get that line kind of leading you towards that person coming, and the 7.1 aperture gave me a little bit of a starburst on the bicycle here. But this is just a typical kind of street scene for me. Blue hour, so it's getting a little bit darker, but it's not nighttime. But the city lights are on, and in this case, the neon and the store signs and that sort of thing, and they give off usually a little bit of a warmer glow, and I think that's a nice contrast with kind of the overall blue hour look of the environment, if you will. So these street scenes, I love, just absolutely adore shooting them. And then speaking of lights, here's another example. Now, this is a very small town. This is a small town called Tucumcari, New Mexico. It's along Route 66, as it says here. But the Blue Swallow Motel is probably one of the best known spots along this stretch of Route 66. And I have not been on the entire Route 66, to be clear, but I've been essentially the whole thing in California and Arizona and New Mexico and Texas and most of Oklahoma. And this is by far my favorite spot out of any of those states. It's just got so much character. They have this old car that's parked out front. I love neon. And in this case, there was an approaching storm, which made things kind of dark and moody. So you kind of play up, again, the warmth of the lights coming off the sign and the office and that sort of thing, and play that off of kind of the moody, dark blue that's kind of in the sky. This one was with the 24 to 240, which again, I no longer have. I found that I wasn't really shooting that long. Most of the time, 24 to 70 is all I need, unless it's something like a one-off. But generally speaking, I wasn't using that lens, and so I sold that back to sold that and then picked up these other things. But here I was at 30 mil, as you know, as you can see, like I'm not really shooting really distant most of the time. But light, color, all that kind of stuff is fun. And then light and color, here it is, London. Again, my favorite city. This is at night. And here I was looking for kind of the lines, and you can kind of see this kind of semicircular kind of oval pattern that's down in here. And it kind of loops around, and then this line here kind of leads, and they're kind of converging in the distance. And then you've got the Shard, which is the famous modern skyscraper on the south bank of the River Thames in London, standing up there. And then you've got all these office lights on and that sort of thing. It's just, it's a typical cityscape that I like to shoot, which is lower light, the lights are on, and a little bit of difference in terms of the color and the light that you can kind of play off of each other. Here's another view of London. This one shot from the Tower Bridge, looking at the Shard again. That last photo was taken standing right about here, looking that way. But this is up on the bridge, and this is 30 seconds, again, with a wide angle, and that's just conveying that sense of movement. Really smooth water on the river, smooth clouds in the sky, and then stark kind of modern architecture. Even though it's London and it's a historic place, this is all the modern stuff. So, well, not all of it, but that's the Shard, and then this is like their City Hall building and that sort of thing. So you got a lot more of that modern kind of not rough, what's the word? It's just sharp and kind of, kind of crisp, whereas the sky and the water are kind of smooth. So I like that. And then one of my other favorite photography quotes is this one from Henri Cartier-Bresson: "Your first 10,000 photographs are your worst." He was a famous film photographer, if you're familiar with his work. These days, I'd say probably like your first 100,000 photographs are your worst. The point here is really just that you get better by doing things. Most people do. I certainly do. The more I exercise a muscle, the stronger that muscle gets. And so when I go out and take photos, especially in cities, I take a lot of photos. And I don't want to call it spray and pray. I try to put thought and a plan into action when I'm out shooting. But there's just so much that you can shoot that I try to take a lot of photos because I'm trying to get in my reps. Maybe that's a way of looking at it. So having said all that, if there's not any questions about those things, I'll jump into a few edits here. And we'll take a look at some photos. So I'm in the Luminar Neo. I'm an ambassador for the Skylum team. I need to move this taskbar. Pardon me 1 second here. Anyway, I'm an ambassador for the Skylum software team, representing Luminar Neo. It's the editor that I use. I find that I've got incredible control over light and detail and color. Those are the three things that I think about when I'm editing, and those are the three that I'm constantly thinking about when I'm editing. And in addition to that, light being the primary one. I mean, these are photographs, right, comprised of light. I'm thinking about light throughout the entire edit. And so in this case, I'd go into develop raw. I like to hit the J key. It will give me with a red overlay for blown out highlights and a blue overlay for kind of crushed shadows. But I like to come in and just play a little bit with the light here, just to kind of even out some of these tones. You can see what's happening here. I'm going to do some minor stuff here. And this is that photo that was at the beginning. And I'll probably edit it a little bit different today than I did in the photo that you saw before. But, I might even brighten it just a little bit, maybe something about like that. And then I always start with develop raw. I shoot in raw, and I want to use that rich data from the raw file in my first developing of the image, if you will. But then secondly, I pretty much 99% of the time go into a tool called super contrast. And as the name implies, it's incredible at helping you adjust contrast in the image. And in this case, the reason it's so good is because it separates the three tonal areas: highlights, midtones, and shadows. And it just gives you the ability to come in and really dial in the contrast. You can see here that I'm playing just with highlights. So that's going to be mostly the sky. And then with the midtones, I'm going to go a little bit left on the balance, increase that contrast a little bit. And then shadows, I can adjust that pretty significantly as well. So something maybe about like that. I'm going to hit the J key just to turn off that overlay. I don't mind if I have a tiny bit of red indicating blown out areas or a tiny bit of blue indicating really dark areas. I think that's kind of normal, to be honest. I see some spots. And so one of the cool things is that you can just automatically remove dust spots in the erase tool. You just give it a second to go in and figure out where those spots are. But there's one here in the sky, there's one here in the water, and it should grab those and get rid of them for me and just make my life easier. And it did. And I just love that. So that's a quick and easy adjustment. Now, one of the things that Luminar is known for is having really powerful AI tools. And a tool that's incredibly powerful is called Enhanced AI. And within that, there's this one called Accent AI. And as the name implies, it's a great kind of accent piece. Now, you can go really high and really pop an image. I tend not to go that high because it gets pretty intense pretty quickly. Although it depends on how much color and that sort of stuff you like. I like bold color. So to me, that doesn't really look bad. But you can come in and dial that in pretty specifically. And of course, you have masking tools on each of these filters if you want to use them. I'm going to go ahead and leave it like that. It gives it a nice little pop. There it is before and after. And then I'm going to come down to landscape, and I'm going to pop golden hour, which does a nice job of taking the tones that are already warm and giving them a little extra kick. That's kind of what golden hour does. So before and after just adds a little bit of warmth overall to the photo, but especially in the areas that already have some of those warm tones, which is helping that tree line really pop. And then I'll just jump into vignette, and I'll just add a quick vignette, a little bit of inner light, which, as the name implies, it'll basically just brighten the center of the photo unless you click choose subject, in which case it will brighten the center of whatever you choose as your default location or your subject. I'm going to go back to the center of the photo because that works for this one. And there's before and after the vignette. And really, honestly, a quick before and after photo or edit. There it is before, and there it is after. So you can see how you can really quickly go through and make a powerful impact on your images without taking a whole lot of time, which again is part of the power and, frankly, I think the fun of using Luminar Neo. Now, having done that, I talked earlier about going to the Charles Bridge in Prague, getting up at 4:30, some awfully early time, and getting out and shooting. And sure, I was tired later that day, and I probably didn't shoot sunset, although I don't remember. But I tell you what, I got a lot of photos like this where I had the Charles Bridge to myself. Now, there is a person walking here. It's just that this was like an extended exposure because it was so dark, and so you can't quite see them. But regardless, I'm going to go in and do a little bit of an edit. I'm going to brighten the photo a little bit, pull down the highlights. I need to hit the J key just so I can see that. You can see I got a little bit of blown out in those street lights, but I don't really care about that. It doesn't really bother me. I may go a tiny bit warmer, tiny bit of tint, maybe a little bit of vibrance, and a little bit of sharpening. Those are the tools, or I should say sliders, within Develop Raw that I typically use the most when I'm in Develop. But pretty quickly, before and after, I've got a decent looking photo. I'm going to hit the J key just so you don't see that overlay. I'm going to go to tool number 2, which is super contrast, and one that I love. And I'm going to come in here and just play around a little bit. You can see how this highlights is kind of hitting that spot in the sky. I kind of like having that lit up a little bit more. I'm going to do a little bit of midtones contrast to brighten that a little bit, and then maybe darken the shadows just a tiny bit. So the before and after, before, see, it looks a little bit flatter, and after, it's got a little bit more pop, a little bit more contrast. And the other thing to think about here is whenever you're impacting contrast, by default, it's going to make the colors look a little bit different. That's another reason I like to do my light adjustments first and continue that as a kind of a thread throughout my entire edit, is because I tend to do light first and then detail and then color. And I do see spots here. I'm not going to remove them simply because I demoed that on the last photo. So you know how that works. I just want to point out I do see those. But I like to do light and then detail and color, but I do color last partly because of the fact that my adjustments to the light will change contrast, which will make the colors look more intense or bold or saturated. And so just be careful with that. Now, Luminar, the way they've evolved this platform, they've added the option to buy things called extensions, which are add-on features. And there's one called Magic Light. And this one will actually come in and allow me, it'll automatically identify little pinpricks of light in a photo. And you can see what I'm doing here. I'm just enhancing what's happening with those street lights. They already, let me show you the before, they already, because this was shot at a tighter aperture, they already had a little bit of a starburst on them. But now I'm just enhancing that, bringing that up a little bit. And, you know, I recommend that you play around with this a little bit. You can change the width of the beams. You can add more glow. You can add a little bit more clearness to it, make them brighter or darker, and even change the number of beams. So I can make it look like a multi-point star if I wanted to. That seems to, yeah, there we go. But it's just a fun feature, something I like to play with on cityscapes, because you often have street lights, and sometimes those little pinpricks of light can look really cool, shoot at a tight aperture. And if you didn't shoot at a tight aperture, you can still go and add that with Magic Light. So I think that's pretty cool. Now, Develop, I already did Develop Raw. So the first time you use it, you're working with the raw file. Any other use of a tool is kind of like an adjustment layer in Photoshop. You're like a layer above it, if you will. By the way, all my edits are over here. So there's my Develop Raw, there's Super Contrast, there's Magic Light. But the second or third time, or any time that's not the first time using Develop, it'll be called just Develop instead of Develop Raw. And one of the things I like to do is come in and just I want to go into the masking tools. And they've got some great masking tools here, including Mask AI, which will automatically identify different areas in the photo and create a mask for them, saving you a lot of work. So this will go in, and what I want to do here is just grab the sky. So it found the sky. I click on sky, and you give it a minute, and it's going to go ahead and create a mask for me in that sky. There it is. And then I can just come in and do things like, maybe I want the sky to be a little bit darker to make it feel a little bit more ominous or something like that. Or maybe I want it maybe to not be quite as blue. Maybe I can drag the temperature a little bit to the right. You get the point, which is masking is available and useful, and it's AI driven if you use Mask AI, and it can have a huge impact on your photo. And in fact, as far as masking goes, I might want to darken the foreground a little bit. So I might open develop again, get a linear gradient this time, come in here and drag that something like that. And what I like to do is basically fade that linear gradient into the photo, which means the edit that I'm about to make with this, which is going to be to darken that area, is going to fade gradually because of this gradient zone that I've created by stretching out this linear gradient pretty far. So you can adjust accordingly. If you go really short like that, then it's a bit more of an abrupt change. And I like the broad kind of gradual change. And so I'm going to kind of adjust this linear gradient to be something about like that. And then I come over here to adjustments, and I'm just going to drop the exposure a little bit. And that just darkens the foreground to get you focused a little bit more on the stuff in the distance. And so that's a way to use masks along with develop or other tools to be kind of targeted and specific with your edits. Yes. So Bob, I see that there's a question about going black and white. And in fact, yes, I do. In fact, this next photo is going to be black and white. And I agree. I love color. So I habitually edit in color, and I think in color, and I look for color when I'm out taking photographs. But I'm trying real hard to do more monochromes because I really do love them. And I just think a lot of photos look fantastic as monochromes. And I think this one, I did this one in color many times, and I've done it in monochrome many times. And I think it looks kind of awesome. Yeah, I was actually going to do this one in monochrome. So I'm going to do some basic stuff here, and that's about it. And instead of going to super contrast right away after develop raw, I'm going to go into black and white and go ahead and convert this. And the nice thing is you've got these luminance sliders, as you probably expect. I can adjust the luminance of the blue to create a little bit more drama in my photo if I want to. I'll pull that down just a little bit. And now I'm going to go to super contrast, because if you create a whole lot of contrast in a colorful photo, as I said a moment ago, it'll set off the colors. So I would rather convert this to black and white first and then go do super contrast, because then I'm not getting distracted, and I may push the contrast to an unreasonable amount for a color photo, but on a black and white, it might look fantastic. So I'm going to just play around with some of this right here and see what we come up with, because there's a lot you can do, but something about like that looks pretty good, but in color, that's probably too much contrast, and that would set off a lot of the color and just make it look kind of bad, to be honest. Also, Accent AI, it pops the colors a lot, as I showed you on a previous photo. I tend to use it kind of sparingly and with masks to be targeted, but on a black and white, like, who cares? Like, there's no color, so you don't have that overwhelming like sugar rush of too much color. You just have a nice, I think, fairly beautiful black and white here. And then the other thing I often like to do with monochromes is go into, it's called toning in Luminar. In other apps, you'll know it as split toning, but I like to go into the highlights, and I like to drag to about a 230. And that is, just on the edge of being blue. So right around there. And then I drag this to the right and just increase the saturation of that blue in the highlights. And what this does is it creates a bit of a silver look. So there's your traditional monochrome, black and white, whatever you want to call it. There it is, kind of the traditional look. And then there's this kind of silver look. And this silver look, I think of it as like, I call it moonlight. I don't really know why. I think, by the light of the silvery moon, maybe, but I think of it as a moonlight kind of look. But I do that by adjusting the hue to around 230 and then just dragging the saturation to wherever I want it to be to get the look that I want. I could do the same in shadows to add to it if I wanted to. And in fact, I'll just do that while we're here. Let me get that. So you can see that creates even more intensity around the amount of blue/silver. I try not to go too saturated because it will really look blue, and I want it to be silver, not blue. So a lower amount of saturation, 20 to 30, whatever it might be. Well, I was in the 40s for highlights, but overall, to me, that looks pretty silver versus that is just black and white. So black and white versus silver. Anyway, yeah, I totally agree, Bob. I love monochromes. And especially if it's like, I hate to say this because this will show you my bias towards color, but if it's a blah, cloudy day and it's not a great sunset or something, I'll often think, okay, these are going to be black and white. And that's not necessarily the best way to approach it, but it is a way that I think at times. But yeah, you can make some lovely, lovely monochromes in Luminar. Now, the opposite of monochrome would be something like this. This is a double-decker bus in the theater district in London going by. And I talked about this in the slides. And now I'll do a quick edit just to show you a couple of things that I think about. So, again, I tend to do a little bit of smart contrast, maybe lift some of these shadows. For night shots in the cities, I almost every time, not always, but like a high 90% of the time, I drag the temperature to the left simply because there's so much kind of yellow orange that comes off of all the different lights in the city. And to me, sometimes it almost looks like it has a little bit of green in it. And there's nothing wrong with green. If you're shooting a field of flowers or a landscape or Kermit the Frog, you want the green. Other than that, I don't really want green in a lot of my photos. I mean, little accents of green like these lights, sure. I don't want a green toned photo. And so I'll often take the temperature pretty far to the left. And that also may involve me taking the tint to the left to add a little bit of that magenta. I don't think I'll do that here because it doesn't have a strong green cast, but it felt like it was a little too warm to me. Like that feels too warm. So I'm going to go left and get a little bit more coolness in it. And the other thing about that for me is when I'm editing, I think of nighttime as being cooler and therefore it should be more blue, whereas daytime is warmer, should be more kind of to the right on the temperature. It just depends on the photo, of course, but that's kind of how I go about thinking about these things when I'm editing. And that's the kind of stuff I try to play up in an edit. So before and after with Develop Raw, I mean, pretty significant change, but we're just getting started, to be honest. Super contrast is tool number 2 here, and I just think it looks fantastic. I generally move each of these contrast sliders about a third of the way, 20, 25, 30, something like that. And then I'll just start swinging, kind of rocking the balance back and forth. I like that balance going to the left with the highlights. Makes them a little bit more intense, but I kind of like it. The midtones, I kind of like it to the left as well. And then shadows, it's going to go brighter if I go left. It's going to go a little darker if I go to the right. I'm going to go barely to the right, just a little bit there. But overall, before and after, a decent change in contrast, I'm now going to come in, with golden hour, which is in their landscape category, and give that a nice bump. And as I said on the skyline of Austin photo, I used golden hour there. It basically takes the tones that are already kind of warm and it gives them a bit of a boost. The reason I did that here is because I like to play up that warm versus cool in my edit, as I talked about before, but there's a lot of warmth here, especially on this right-hand side, because double-decker buses are red. And so, and then this streak here of that light, and then even on the left-hand side, some of the building kind of lights look yellow. So I'm bringing up some of that warmth. So before and after, I just think that accentuates that a little bit. But one of the things I don't really like here is that because of the blur, this whole area behind the blur, obviously you can see through it, but it's it's too faded for me. It doesn't look right. So I'm going to use develop, and I'm going to get a mask, and I'll get a linear gradient. And here I'm going to drag this like that over here. And so basically my mask is covering the majority of this blur, and then it starts fading into nothing over here. And that's kind of what I want to do. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust the contrast, and I'm going to play with the temperature. Yeah, I kind of like it a little bit cooler, actually. I'm going to bump up the saturation and vibrance. I mean, it's a double-decker bus, light streak kind of thing in a city at night. I'm all about bringing those colors up. I'm going to check the shadows. Yeah, I'm going to bring the shadows down a little bit. I might actually go a little bit more contrast, but maybe go a tad brighter. Let's look at the before and after. Before, see how it's a little more almost like a matte finish. It's kind of faded, a little bit faded, I guess is the term for it. And now it's got a little bit more contrast. I'm going to take that exposure back down. I kind of think I like it like that. But this is basically a mask designed to create a little bit more impact in that area and remove some of what felt like it was just a faded area that I just kind of wanted to amp up a little bit, I guess is what it comes down to. So I think that's it. There is a crop tool, by the way, in Luminar, of course, and I end up cropping my photos quite a bit. In this case, I think I would do something about like a 16:9, get rid of some of that excess foreground. I'd probably pull this up a little bit. You can straighten here as well. Let's pretend that's straight, and I'm going to go ahead and say apply, and it's going to crop the photo for me and straighten it. And that also, in cropping an image like this, it obviously it tightens up the composition, but it kind of brings that bus a little bit more forward, so it's a little bit more like, you know, in your face, so to speak. And I just kind of like, that look. And then I think that I would do a vignette. And here I'm gonna just take a vignette, something like that, feather that. I like the feathered vignette. I like inner light, but I don't want the inner light to default to the center of the photo, which is right there. I'm going to choose subject, and I'm going to put the center of the vignette kind of over here, like at the front of the bus. Maybe something about like that. And that just, obviously it's a vignette, so it's going to darken the edges, but that inner light is now based on where I place the center. So the inner light is going to emanate from that area over there at the front of the bus, and that other, I guess that was a car kind of moving in front of it. But there it is before, and there it is after. And I might even go a little bit tighter on the vignette. I try not to do an overly heavy-handed vignette, but in some cases, I think it kind of works. I think here it kind of works. And so I think that's my whole edit for this photo. So if you look at the before and the after, you see how we kind of brought up the light and the color and that sort of thing. So just a lot you can do with Luminar, and it doesn't really take a whole lot of time. I think what I'll do now is maybe I'll go over here, and I want to get this one. And this is a pretty quick edit, pretty simple one. This is the Tiber River, I believe it's called, in Rome. The Vatican is out of frame to the right, and it was a beautiful sunset with a dirty river. I'm not going to take all these bits of trash out with the erase tool, but of course you can do that. And I would do that before finishing the photo to clean it up. But I want to do a few edits here. I want to add a little bit of contrast, pull down the highlights a little bit, maybe lift the shadows a tiny bit, maybe something like that. I'm going to go into the whites and maybe pull up the whites just a little bit. That helps with that bridge. That's kind of white right there. And then for temperature, I want to go a little bit warmer. It was a nice little sunset. I like to go a little bit of tint simply because I like magenta in my sunsets. I think it gives it a nice little bit of color, and I just like that. So I do that quite a bit. But if you look at before and after, pretty basic, kind of a getting started thing. But, you know, once again, super contrast, go about a quarter or a third of the way, and then play around, rock that balance back and forth to kind of get the look that you want. And that's what I like about this tool so much, is it just, like if you look at, there's midtones all the way balanced to the right and all the way to the left. It really brightens up that reflection. And I don't want to go all the way left, but I do want to go part of the way. I think that's kind of nice. I feel like the reflection should be darker than the sky. The source of light is the sky, of course. But I want the reflection to pop a little bit more. And I think it does now with a little bit of that extra little bit of extra contrast in that tonal area. So before and after just gives a little bit of pop. Now, one of the things I love editing is color, as I've said probably a few times already, and color harmony is honestly like a magically powerful tool. It's got all these tools within it. So brilliance and warmth, as the name implies, like if you drag the brilliance, it can get intense quickly. So I recommend going small amounts, and also don't use every color tool on every photo. Just use a couple tools, because if you're not careful, you'll end up kind of overdoing it. And you may need to, a good tip for if you think you've overdone it is step away, because I think our eyes get desensitized to the amount of color saturation if we're sitting here staring at things for a while. And being able to back away and kind of reset and then go back. I do that a lot, and I do like color, as I've said repeatedly. I'll often go back and think, oh, I didn't mean to do that. And so it's always good to kind of check. Split color warmth is fantastic, because the warmth slider, if you drag it to the right, the warm tones get warmer, but if you drag it to the left, they get kind of neutralized. You kind of take the warmth out. I don't want to take a warmth out of a golden sunset, so I want to go a little bit to the right. And the cool is the opposite. If I go to the right with the cool, they get the opposite, which is red. And if I go to the left, the cool colors get cooler. Now, I don't want to go that far, but I'm going to go a little bit cooler with the blues. And again, it goes back to this same thing I said earlier. I like to play the warm and cool colors off of each other, because, they're complementary, right? So yellow and blue are complementary colors. I think about this while editing, because I'm trying to create a little bit of visual interest, and maybe even a little bit of visual tension in a photo, where I'm just trying to play up that color contrast and those harmonious colors where they look good together. And I'm trying to accentuate a little bit of both of those. So, and then that's split color warmth, and then color balance. And you may be aware of color balance from Photoshop and other tools. I often will take the shadows and go a little bit toward the blue. You can see kind of what that's doing. It's creating more blue in the shadows, which means the shadows, because they're darker, they're getting more blue, which is a darker color. So in other words, I'm darkening the shadows a little bit, and then I'll often go like into the highlights and maybe add a little bit of red or a tiny bit of magenta, and just a little bit, just to get a little bit of extra color kick there. But color harmony, one of my favorite tools, and you can see before and after, massive difference in the color just with that tool. And for this photo overall, before and after, before and after. So that's that one. And we've got about 5 minutes left, but I definitely want to answer any questions if there are any questions out there. I haven't seen any others in the chat, but if anybody has something, please let me know.
Yeah, and Jim, we did have one pop in from Jeff joining us here on Zoom, asking if there is much difference between shooting at sunset or sunrise besides the location of the sun.
Much difference. Well, for me, the difference is the crowds. So I would do some planning, depending on what, I guess it comes down to, what are you trying to achieve? If you're trying to get like the sun in a certain location, then use apps like PhotoPills or something where you can plan that, so you'll know where it's going to be. But if you're not trying to get that in a photo, like with a landscape, you're pretty often trying to do that. In cityscapes, I'm not always trying to get the actual sunset. I'm trying to get that warm light maybe coming across the photo, like like in this one in Rome that we just did, or this one here, which is Florence, where there was a sunset happening, but the sunset was behind me. And so in this case, the sun was hitting the Ponte Vecchio. And I haven't edited this photo, but the sun was hitting my subject, if you will. So it depends on what you want in the photo. But for me, the big difference is dealing with the crowds or not dealing with the crowds is kind of what it comes down to most of the time for me. So I don't know if that's if that's what you meant by the question, Jeff. If I misunderstood, please feel free to ask it, maybe reword it if I was off base there. But yeah, for me, it's the major thing is the crowds and the light and that sort of thing. And as far as crowds go, it's because you could have something like the Charles Bridge essentially empty. One person walked by. The only people I saw out, I was here till 6 or 7 in the morning. By 7 a.m., people started showing up. But part of that, the only people I saw were generally people going home that hadn't been home yet from the night before. So if you're interested in kind of empty street scenes, then sunrise is definitely the way to do that. Yeah,
Perfect. Jim, let's see can we sneak one last question in for you?
Mm-hmm.
Do you approach different cities differently, or is your approach to a city photographically the same?
Ooh, probably the same. I mean, the short answer is, my preparation is, okay, I'm going to well, London's a bad example. Let me use Budapest, Hungary. I've never been. I'm going to be there in December, and it's a family trip. But in this example, I'm going to pretend it's a photo trip. So I'm going to pretend like I'm planning out a bunch of photo opportunities. So what I do before I go to a place, if I've never been, is I go to Google image search. I search blogs about the best places to take photos in different cities. And actually on my website, obviously I don't have for Budapest, I've never been, but I have lists that I've made over the years for London, probably about 20 or 25 different cities. So there are millions, I'm sure, of people like me that have put things on their blogs that list these. A popular title is best Instagram spots in, whatever city. And then the other site I use is Flickr. And I still use Flickr. I love Flickr. I've been on it for, I don't know, 10 or 12 years, whatever it is. But it's great. It's got an amazing search. And you can just go in there and locate images. And then you can start kind of trying to figure out. So I do that. That's the first thing I do. And then I start looking on the map, as I mentioned earlier, where I'll get often a physical map just for my planning purposes, because I like to do it visually. And you can do this Google Maps and drop pins and stuff, which is probably a smarter way to do it. But sometimes I'm old school and I just want to get pen and paper and just kind of look at things. But I'll start figuring out what spots do I want to hit and what is near them. I'll look at transportation options in a city like Budapest, or London. I mean, the tube is kind of everywhere. And then I'll start planning out routes. And then the other thing I like to do is figure out, okay, where do I want to be at certain times of day? Is this a street? Are the photos I've seen from, ABC Street in whatever town, are these daytime shots? Are these nighttime shots? Are these sunset or sunrise? Like, is the sun going to be in a position, like maybe I want sunset at Big Ben, for example, then I got to be there at sunset or sunrise, whatever it may be. So I do plan around the kind of the big events, which is for me, the edges of the day. In the morning, it would be kind of blue hour, twilight, and then sunrise, and then golden hour. And in the evening, it would be golden hour, and then sunset, and then blue hour. Those are kind of the 2 times a day, but the 6 different things, 3 in the morning, 3 in the evening, that I think about, and I plan my big stuff around those, and then I work in stuff in between it. And to be fair, like, all plans get trashed when either the light goes off and it's amazing, or it starts raining, or something else goes wrong, or something goes well. So you just never know. I like to build a plan, but keep in mind that 2 things. Number one, 99% of the time my plan is going to change, and I'm either not going to get everything on the list, or I'm not going to get every shot that I want. And number 2, in a city like London or New York or even Budapest or anywhere that you may go that's a city of any size, you just can't get it all shot unless you're there for a couple of months, kind of thing. And most of us are doing this on a vacation, or we have a dedicated photo trip. But I once spent 10 days in London. I still have places that I want to go shoot that I didn't get to. And I was there for 10 whole days. And all I was doing was photography. I wasn't there for any kind of work other than Jim is here to take photos. So I have to go into it knowing that everything isn't going to happen on this trip, and I'm going to have to come back someday if I want to get it. So I'd say I probably approach things the same. I guess that was a very long answer to perhaps a simple question, but yeah. I approach them the same, but that's kind of my approach.
Perfect. Some great information there. And if I could sneak one last question in, Jay,
Yeah,
slip the
please.
question in here. What is your criteria for using masking AI versus individual brushes?
Yeah, so in Luminar, I will say honestly, I probably use the brush, the radial gradient, and the linear gradient more than I use Mask AI. And it's for a couple of reasons. And I've got, if you follow me on YouTube, I've got a number of videos about masking. And then I actually sell an entire course on my website about masking in Luminar Neo. Um, and I point that out simply because like I built a 17 video course about masking. In other words, there's not like a simple answer, but it depends on the image. It depends on what Mask AI will identify. The thing with Mask AI is it's great. As you saw, I used it here at least once, like in the sky in that Prague photo or Charles Bridge photo, but it doesn't have a gradient. It identifies an object or a region like sky or building or car. The thing is, what I will often want to do with my edits is I want a transition along the edge. I want that gradient. You can get that with a brush because you can make a kind of a softer edge brush. You can get that with a radial gradient because you can feather it. And the same with a linear gradient. And you saw me kind of fade that linear gradient on the foreground here in this Charles Bridge photo. But Mask AI, it just masks the region or the object or whatever it might be. In other words, it's a hard edge. And so if you want your effect or your edit, I guess, to kind of fade and blend gently into the rest of the photo, then you may not want to use Mask AI. And I'm not saying it's a bad tool. It does exactly what it's supposed to do. It just depends on what it is that you're masking, what it is that you're doing in terms of the edit, and how much you're doing. If it's a pretty minor thing, like here, it was a pretty minor thing, and you can't see that it didn't perfectly get the sky, and you can't see that the edge of the mask is a hard edge. You can't really tell that in this photo. But if I were to go in and significantly change something, then you would start to notice because there would be a little bit of a halo around the edge. And so I will often use a brush to add a little gradient around the edge of something that Mask AI creates, or I'll just use a linear gradient or a radial gradient or a brush by themselves. So I mean, this is something we could talk about for hours, and so I will shut up. But it's a great question, and it's an important question, and the answer is fairly long. But hopefully, what I've just said gives you an idea about how I approach that.
Awesome. Wonderful question. Wonderful answer. And as Jim stated, to start this workshop out today, there are 2 more parts. So if you guys do want to watch and rewatch, you can head over to YouTube or Vimeo. Just look up B&H Event Space on both. And like we said, we got 2 more parts to this, so you guys can always rejoin us. Part 2 is tomorrow. So if you do have any questions lingering, pop back in tomorrow and get them asked. I want to thank Jim and, of course, the entire team at Sony for making this series possible. Huge thank you to you, Jim. And we don't have to wait long. We'll see you again tomorrow, right?
See you tomorrow. Yeah. Thank you, B&H. Thank you, Sony. Thanks, everybody, for showing up and hanging out and the Q&A. It was a lot of fun. So appreciate it. See you tomorrow.
Awesome. Sounds good, Jim. And to all of our viewers out there, thank you, as always, for tuning in. We will see you guys next time on another rendition of the B&H Virtual Event Space. Catch y'all next time.
Adios. Thanks.